Hi and welcome to Ask Wardee. I'm Wardee, a wife and mom of 3 and the lead teacher and founder of TraditionalCookingSchool.com. I'm also the author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Fermenting Foods. Ask Wardee is the weekly show devoted to your niggling questions about traditional cooking. Maybe it's your sourdough starter, your sauerkraut, superfoods, broth, or anything else to do with traditional cooking. That's what we talk about. You can catch Ask Wardee live each Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, that's 1 p.m. Eastern, or through the podcast or video replays at askwardee.tv. And now let's get to today's show. Well, welcome to Ask Wardee, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with me. This is Ask Wardee episode 21. And for those of you watching this as a replay later, you can check out the podcast recording, the video of this episode, and any links and what I'm talking about at the show notes, tradcookschool.com/AW021, or if you can't remember that, askwardee.tv, and look for episode 21. Have a great question about sourdough to answer today, and sourdough starter feeding. It comes from Pam F. She says, do you always have to feed the same kind of flour each day, such as wheat, spelt, etc., or can you change that daily or weekly? I noticed that you said you could bake with any kind of flour, which I have said, but can you feed it with different flours? We grow our own grains, so I'm wondering how to change flours when you need to in the starter, and how often you can change it when added to the starter. So that's a great question. And Pam, first of all, I want to say woohoo to you for growing your own grains. That is a huge deal. Very, very huge. So I applaud you for being part of that sustainable practice, feeding your families, and perhaps you're supplying other families too. And so just keep up with it. I'm just so proud of that for you. So basically what Pam is asking, just the short version of this, there's 2 parts to this question. Can I feed my sourdough starter with different kinds of flour? And the second part to that is, if yes, how often and what are the rules? So let's get into that now. The very quick, short answer to Pam's question, the first part of the question, is yes, you can. You can feed your starter different kinds of flour. And it sounds like you need to because you're growing different kinds, and so you might have different ones available at different times of year. And even those of us, we don't grow our own grains, we might have different grains or flours ground. So rather than go grind something else, why couldn't we just feed what we have? In fact, my friend Katie from Kitchen Stewardship, I learned this from her a long time ago, years ago. She and I were both getting into sourdough about the same time, and she would take her leftover oatmeal that the family hadn't eaten at breakfast, and she would use that to feed her sourdough starter. Now that's pretty frugal, right? And she's using a starch, a grain, because the thing is your sourdough starter, the bacteria and yeast in there, they need a sugar source. And all grains have starch. So really it's not a wheat, it's not a rye thing, it's not a spelt thing, it's not an einkorn thing, but they all have this starch that the yeast and bacteria can eat. So even leftover oatmeal works. So that's the short answer, yes, you can. Now, let's go into some particulars to answer kind of the nuance of what Pam is asking. So here are some things to keep in mind, and I have 3 things to mention. So number 1 is, you got to be observant. You got to just see how your starter is handling it. Now, my sourdough starter, I started with a starter from Cultures for Health, and I fed it whole wheat. Then we started sourdough with spelt in our house, and I switched that over to spelt. And then we began using Einkorn, the oldest wheat there is, and I switched it to Einkorn. I just started feeding it Einkorn one day. And I have one starter, and that's kind of a story because it's gone through some changes. I've shared it before. But my sourdough starter has gone through lots of different types of flour, and whenever I change it, it just takes it. It just takes it. Absolutely no blip, whatever. It just takes it. Now, I have heard from other people that when they change their starter's food source, it takes it hard. So I don't know if you'd call it like it's offended or what, but it kind of takes a downturn, gets its feelings hurt, and it takes a couple feedings to bounce back and get back to its previous level of activity. So that's why this point number 1 is just to pay attention to your starter and see how it's handling it. So if it just, you feed it a different flour and it's just as active and the same as usual, You don't even have to wait for any kind of transition period, just start using it. Now, if it takes a dip in activity, keep feeding it, don't give up. You could probably still use it for recipes where it doesn't require a ton of activity, and basically that's anything like sandwich bread. But if you need it for sandwich bread, then you want to wait till it resumes its normal activity level. And so that's just through, a few feedings, regular care and maintenance to get it back to its usual activity level. All right, so second point about this is if you are changing up the flour, don't neglect the starter in other ways. So that means keep it warm, keep your feedings regular, etc. The normal TLC, you shower on your starter to keep it healthy. Don't neglect any of that when changing its flour source, because if your starter is the least bit temperamental, or it's not even temperamental, it's handling the flour fine, but maybe there is kind of a stress that we can't see, can't measure or whatever on it. So don't stress it out in other ways. Keep the other things consistent so that the change of flour can well be handled by your sourdough starter. Okay, so don't shock it any more than you need to. And the third point to make, Pam, and this addresses your question of, well, if so, then, how often and what are the rules? Well, there's really no rules. I mean, okay, I'm going to tell you about a couple rules in just a minute. But basically, I want to say change the flours as often as you need to. And in your house, because you're growing different kinds of grains, it sounds like you need to change it. Just change it as often as you need to, or as often as your starter can handle it. And that's because if there are any rules, here they are. Your own rule. So what flours do you have on hand? Is it leftover oatmeal? Is it the wheat crop, the spelt crop, the Einkorn crop? So whatever flour you have on hand, that could be your rule of what you need to feed your starter. And because you can, do it. Just pay attention to those other things. Make sure it's happy and fed and not neglected in other ways, so that if it does take some time to bounce back, your TLC can help make that happen. Now, the other rule is the starter's rule. So remember, I've been talking about this basically through my whole Ask Wardee today. Your starter has its own rule, and everybody's starter is different, but as you change flours, you're going to see how your starter handles it. So it has preferences of its own that it'll communicate to you through that. If it's laid back, or if it's, which I saw in the comments, somebody said laid back starter. So if the starter's laid back and it just bounces back, no problem. Or if the starter, gets its feelings hurt and needs a little bit of TLC. And in the comments, I saw someone saying they named their starter Charlie. And we've talked about this before. People have names for their sourdough starter. And even if you don't have a name for your sourdough starter, it becomes very, very important in your kitchen. Like mine is as important to me as my Vitamix. Like I just consider it one of my #1 tools in my kitchen, but it's also got a personality, right? It's not just this inanimate object, but you feed it and care for it just like you do your babies. And you pay attention to it and its needs and how it's reacting and how it feels. I mean, it communicates that to you through its activity level. In the comments, someone is saying emotional starter. Yeah, it's the kind of emotions that a starter feels. And they're pretty animalistic. They have to do with temperature and food. We all have those feelings too, right? I mean, if we're cold or too hot, or if we're hungry or too full, we have emotions too. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a departure from the question, just to talk about the nature of a sourdough starter. So here's a quick summary. Yes, you can feed different flours to your starter. Things to keep in mind: how's your starter handling it? So adjust as necessary to get it through the bump if it has one. Don't neglect the starter when changing flours so it doesn't have any additional stresses on it. If changing the flour is a stress, it may not be at all. And third, change the flours as often as you need to, or as often as your starter can handle it. And this may change over time. Okay, so we've come to the end of how I wanted to answer Pam's question. If you all have additional questions, I'll take them for a minute or two. If you don't, then I'll move on. I have something I want to share with you. So in the comments, Ruth and Ray is saying, my Einkorn starter bounced back after not discarding, just vigorously stirring. Now it's bubbling. Great. So by that, I'm assuming you had that kind of normal hiccup of when you didn't see any activity, and in our sourdough e-course we recommend, instead of feeding it again when you're building up your starter, stir vigorously and just give it a little bit more time to build up, to a mature starter. Ruth and Ray, can I bake bread after 3 days? I think 3 days is a little bit soon for bread, but you certainly could do pancakes or English muffins or waffles. There's one of those recipes that doesn't require a mature and really active, strong starter. Pancakes are great. Other than cheese and other starters, what do I need to keep it away from? Yeah, I would not keep it near your kombucha or your cheese or your other dairy ferments. It's probably okay near a veggie ferment, but just as a general rule, we say 5 feet apart. And sourdough and cheese do not mix well. Ruth and Ray, when for bread? Okay, when for bread is it's a judgment call, but a week, 2 weeks of really good, strong activity. It gets really bubbly and domed, produces hooch, it smells fresh and sour. You just see a lot of activity. So when you feel it's strong, go ahead and try bread. And no-knead bread is a great one to start with, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment. Amy, my wheat starter is really thick. Is that normal? Yeah, thick can be a factor of how much water you're including, and as a general rule, we like to keep a thick starter because a thick starter rises better, so you can better gauge its activity level. A thin starter, it's just so thin, the bubbles don't do as much, so you sometimes miss its activity. So we recommend keep a thick starter because then you can more easily observe what's going on with it. All right, so now I've come to the point in time when I want to make an announcement. And so, whenever we talk sourdough, I tell you can pick up our free sourdough starter instructions at tradcookschool.com/free starter. But today I have a new thing to share with you. I alluded to it before when I said that a really good recipe to try with a new sourdough starter, fairly new, is a no-knead bread. And so I want to share with you, if you don't have it already, I have available a free recipe at Traditional Cooking School. It's my favorite no-knead artisan sourdough einkorn bread. And if you're watching the video right now or live with me, you can see it on the screen of my iPad. There it is. It's a free recipe you can download. And the link for it is, let me see, I made it for you, tradcookschool.com/free bread. Maybe those of you who are live with me could do me a favor and in the comments type that out, tradcookschool.com/free bread. Here's a closer up picture of this beautiful no-knead einkorn bread. This is the bread we make about every 3 days in our family. We love it. And my husband says that it's the best bread he's ever had. And that means a lot. Not only because I like to please my husband, but because he and I have both had a lifetime of eating varied foods. And so when he says it's the best bread he's ever had, he's comparing it to bakeries and, the stuff that that we both grew up with, that we didn't make, that came, conventional food. And so not only is this healthy and wonderful because of the benefits of sourdough and the ancient grain, but it tastes better than anything we've ever had. Our family absolutely adores it. So thank you to the commenter who put that link there for you. And again, it's tradcookschool.com/free bread. And so, Clay, it looks like there's a little bit of a typo in yours. First of all, free bread, there's no space, and it's Trad Cook School. Right there behind me, tradcookschool.com. Free bread. And if you do want the starter, that's right, because this recipe relies on having a sourdough starter. So if you need the sourdough starter made, that is tradcookschool.com/free starter. You can claim both of those today. Okay, well that's it, everybody. I want to say thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Ask Wardee. Whether you're live or you're checking out this later through the video replay or the podcast, I appreciate you so much. God bless you. Thanks for coming. Thanks so much for coming today. It's been fun. Here's what to do next. Ask Wardee wouldn't be possible without your questions, so please keep them coming. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet me. Use the handle @TradCookSchool with your question and include the hashtag AskWardee. Or you can email me, Wardee@askwardee.tv. To get the show notes, links I mentioned, or even to catch up on past episodes, just go to askwardee.tv. To join the fun of the live video recording of Ask Wardee each week, be sure to follow me at Trad Cook School on the Periscope app, or go to periscope.tv/tradcookschool. We're live every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, that's 1 p.m. Eastern. And finally, you can subscribe to Ask Wardee as a podcast using iTunes, the podcast app, or Stitcher. If you're on a mobile device, just search for Ask Wardee right in the app. If you're on a desktop or laptop, just go to tradcookschool.com/awitunes for Ask Wardee iTunes. And while you're there, please leave a rating or review. I love to read your comments, and your feedback helps others who are interested in traditional cooking find my podcast too. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week.